Hi everyone, and thanks for coming to my paper. This paper comes from a broader project that I'm working on at the moment, funded by the Leverhulme Trust, which is about how children and teenagers growing up in Britain between about 1945 and 1989 think about aging and age stages, so how they conceptualize childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. And this interest in the Cold War is very much source-led, because what I found when I was looking at young people's writings written in a wide variety of different locations for a wide variety of different reasons was that the Cold War and fears about nuclear war kept coming up. So what I was interested to ask in this paper is what's going on here. In 1964, a 16-year-old writer from southern England who was asked to write on the topic myself at 16 reflected that at this age, approaching maturity, one of the biggest factors is growth. And one of the most boring expressions becomes, "My, haven't you grown?" thus giving the correct assumption that you are moving in the right direction. So this essay highlights how both childhood and adolescence in Cold War Britain and the United States were positioned in relation to adulthood. So to be a child or a young person is to be an adult in waiting. As sociologists Jenny Hockey and Alison James have commented, adults tend to ask children, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" or comment on how much they've grown or how much older they seem. So basically they comment on their progress towards adulthood. And this suggests that as a child or an adolescent, your personhood is not yet confirmed. As this 16-year-old wrote in this particular essay, adolescence is future orientated. It only means something insofar as it's part of this progress towards maturity. However, in some of the self-narratives I've encountered written by children and teenagers in Britain and the United States in this period, this focus on the future is thrown into question. So these young writers were really very consciously aware of the threat posed by nuclear weapons and the possibility of the end of the world, perhaps particularly in self-narratives written during what historians have seen as the sort of two key phases of the Cold War, the late 1950s and early 1960s, and then the 1980s. John Holt was a radical progressive American educator who was teaching fifth grade, so 10 to 11-year-olds in the 1950s. And he recalled that in his fifth grade classroom in Massachusetts in 1959, it became common for his pupils to say, "If I grow up," rather than "when." And he wrote about what he thought was happening in these children's heads in his later children's rights text, Escape from Childhood, which he published in 1974. A few of the things my fifth graders said or wrote made it clear that most of them did not have any very secure sense of the future, of a life waiting for them. Some years later, I read that many young people of this age group, they were among the ones who had to practice hiding under their school desks in atomic bomb drills, reported to psychologists or psychiatrists they had frequent nightmares about atomic war, the end of the world, and so on. At the deepest levels of my being, for no reason, I assume the bomb will not go off. A great many young people believe that it will. So here I think Holt is making two arguments. Children and teenagers growing up during the Cold War might not have voiced their fears to adults or authority figures, but the global political situation nevertheless deeply affected them. Secondly, he recognizes that he wasn't a nuclear war denier, but there was something particular about childhood and adolescence that made nuclear fears different for this age group. This paper will consider young people's writing from both Britain and the United States, although the focus on Britain, during the two periods of heightened Cold War anxiety that I already mentioned, the late 50s, early 60s, and the 1980s. For the first period, I'm going to focus on a set of essays written by 15-year-old school pupils from 1962 to 64 in a range of school types in southern England. For the second period, I'm going to look at sociological studies from both Britain and the US that interviewed children and teenagers about nuclear war and the future. In mainstream discussions of nuclear fears in post-war Britain and the US, children were often mobilized as symbols of the future but had no voice of their own. So, for example, Lawrence Whitner has written about the advertising techniques used by SANE, National Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy in the US. So their most famous advertisement, Dr. Spock is Worried, featured the famous child-centered parenting gurus saying, "I am worried." Not so much about the effects of past tests, but about the prospect of endless future ones. As the tests multiply, so will the damage to our children, here and around the world. And he added, "Who gives us this right?" So this obviously is talking about nuclear tests rather than nuclear war, but children were also mobilized as symbols of anti-war protests, not just concerns about nuclear fallout. So, for example, by the British Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, founded in 1958. Members of CND often cited concern about future generations as their reason for joining CND, especially women. Nuclear fears were also expressed through child figures in adult science fiction films in both Britain and the US during this period, with British-made films dominating. So, for example, Village of the Damned, 1960, Children of the Damned, 1963, and The Damned and Lord of the Flies, which were both released in the same year, all explicitly or implicitly drew upon nuclear imagery and featured threatening children who personified adult fears of a nuclear future. These films were all based on British science fiction novels from the 50s, and with their X certificates were not aimed at a juvenile audience, although arguably I think a lot of young people would have snuck in to see them. Despite the lack of children and adolescents' voices in public discussions about nuclear war, their fears became evident when they had the chance to talk about them. Sybil S. Kloner and Milton Schwabel, who completed the first major study of children's attitude to nuclear war in the US in 1965, noted that 70% of the American children that they surveyed spontaneously mentioned nuclear war when they were asked to think about the future. And English teenagers' essays from the Multiple Marking of English Compositions project, written around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, were also often explicit about nuclear fears. Although again, these researchers did not explicitly ask at any point these young people to write about the nuclear threat. As one 15-year-old in this project wrote in 1963, "Most young people do not believe in a future for this world. While they are having fun, there is in the back of their mind the threat of the little man who has his finger on the bottom of the H-bomb." However, traditional accounts of nuclear activism in Britain have tended to downplay teenagers' nuclear fears because they were assessed through a traditional lens of party membership and official political activism in organisations like CND. Writing in 1965, the sociologist Ziemann and Grant confidently asserted that the young are today massively agreed as to their own political incompetence. It does not trouble them. Politics is for the grown-ups. And they stated and showed in this table that only 5% of young people were members of a political party. And there's no clear correlation between party allegiance and age. Because of this, Abrams and Little argued that the young are not a new political generation. They have no collective political self-consciousness. So, firstly, this approach ignores everyone who was not old enough to join a political party or to go by themselves on a protest march, particularly children. Ian Welsh, the historian of nuclear culture, remembers being involved in a protest as a child in northeast England in the early 1960s. It seems to have disappeared from historical memory. So he wrote, "I marched around a school playground chanting 'ban the bomb' along with a majority of other children. Our passive occupation of the playground and refusal to return to lessons until something was done about the bomb resulted in a stern lecture from the headmaster and blocked attention for everybody involved." Abrams and Little did accept that some young people were involved in activism outside traditional political parties. However, the early social historian of CND, Frank Parkin, agreed with their conclusions. Despite the large teenage membership of CND and the existence of a youth branch of the organisation, he argued that only a small minority of young people became involved in CND, and so it is by no means certain that the problem of the bomb has weighed particularly heavily upon the young, in the sense that they regard it as the major issue confronting them in modern times. So Parkin was right that only a small percentage of young people, as with adults, were ever members of C&D, but this doesn't mean they weren't concerned about nuclear war. Furthermore, even teenagers who were explicitly critical of the organisation did not necessarily think that its aims were not worthy. Instead, they critiqued C&D through criticising its teenage contingent and aimed to demonstrate how much more responsible they were than their irresponsible protesting peers. So one 15-year-old wrote in 1962, when they were asked to describe a demonstration. "We saw them some distance away, a mob of people. They looked nothing more. They were waving silly banners of what they supposed was satirical humour on their favourite subject, the bomb. As they grew nearer, I noted that 80% of them were teenagers, and I guessed that most of them were not very well educated, mainly from the spelling on the banners. They passed on, leaving me ruminating on what good these marches did. Certainly they got publicity for the C&D movement, but was it the right kind? If this was a typical example of the members of the C&D movement, there was not much hope of the bomb being banned ever." So these kind of essays show that young writers were engaging quite closely with media depictions of the old Marston marches. As Chris Hill has argued, the press often belittled the marchers and mocked their poor dress. This became such a prominent feature of protest coverage, actually, that C&D employed a dress advisor for the 1961 march. Therefore, young writers who drew on these tropes were deliberately engaging in an adult discourse, asserting their maturity and superiority by criticising their fellow teenagers. But there's no suggestion here the writer actually thinks C&D are wrong. Other critical essays were even more explicit. In 1963, another respondent to this same study run by the Institute of Education wrote, "The antics performed at demonstrations are rather foolish, but ban the bomb and other such slogans are just a way of expressing an opinion that a majority of people hold." Furthermore, the tactic of denigrating one's peers was not confined to non-activist youth. UC&D members often turned this rhetoric back on their fellows. One UC&D branch secretary was interviewed in 1968, complained, "We got a lot of young people who joined us because this was the thing to do among teenagers. They came on older Marston and wore the C&D badge because they thought it would annoy the grown-ups. A lot of these types were in it for the kicks. They couldn't give you any reason for being against the bomb." And Hannah Elizabeth's research shows that UC&D members made similar statements in the 1980s. But not all teenagers asserted their maturity by criticising their peers. Some teenagers in the English Composition and Writing Project employed the language of age explicitly to criticise their parents' generation, suggesting that it was adults who were really childish or immature, and that this was demonstrated by the prospect of nuclear war. As one respondent wrote in 1963, "I have heard it said of the modern teenager by some father, 'Teenagers today, too clever by half.' This, of course, shows sheer ignorance. Just because we know more than he did when he was 15, he thinks that we should do something that will destroy the world. He made a bit of a ham-fisted job of putting the world in order in 1914 and in 1939. The teenager today has brains. He does not want a war. His brains will see to that." Another writer, in an essay on what are some of the commonest causes of disagreement between young people of your age and your parents, wrote, "It is apparent that a Cold War has developed between the younger generation and the old timers of yesteryear. Some people dislike the older generation because of the threat of atomic war. They feel, and rightly so in my opinion, that it was the old scientists of years ago that gave us this threat because of their childish instinct to create things that cause mass destruction." So the employment of the language of age here positions adults as childish, flipping the usual power dynamics. However, this writer also used another rhetorical strategy found in other essays by teenagers. He argued that the supposed irresponsibility of teenagers, exemplified by their lack of financial planning, was actually a rational response to the situation in which they found themselves. He wrote, "Maybe they feel we should save the money, for you'll need it on a rainy day. But what they don't realise is there may never come a rainy day with the threat of atomic war." This is echoed by 17-year-old David McMillan from Hull in the Generation X survey of 1964. I understand how some teenagers go astray. They think they're living on the brink of the H-bomb and want to have a good time before it's too late. I think they should be more down to earth. But again, a lot of them are forced to be superficial because they think the world is in ruins. I think they have a middle-age problem, more acute than the teenage problem. If they had set a better example, things might be different for us. By the 1980s, these teenagers had grown up and had families of their own. In a 1982 article in the US magazine Newsweek, one respondent in a sociological study reflects on the experience of becoming an adult after a childhood lived in the shadow of the Cold War, and argued that young people's fears were finally being taken seriously. The writer wrote, "I'm 30. We huddled under chairs in air raid drills in 3rd grade because the teachers said the Russians might drop a bomb on us. What did they think we were thinking about when we were huddled there? Recess? Lunch? We were thinking about dying. I never considered what I'd be when I grew up. I never seriously considered what I'd be at all. Today's frightened children have parents who have always been frightened. The fear isn't new. What's new is adult validation of that fear. Damn it, why wouldn't somebody validate mine? If parents in the 50s had taken that seriously, you might not be in this mess." However, while this participant felt that young people had now been listened to, many US parents continued to want to protect their children from knowledge of nuclear war, despite clear evidence that children were well aware of the dangers at a young age. And this actually precisely could link to their own memories of nuclear fear. In a survey of parents' responses to an educational unit about nuclear war called Choices, designed in 1986 for use in American schools, the researchers noted that one common objection to this kind of educational unit was, "I was afraid of the end of the world as a child, and I don't want my child to grow up being afraid of the end of the world." And yet young people in the 80s were, if anything, even more frightened than the previous generation had been. 11-year-old Lisa was interviewed for a study in Boston in 1982. She said, "I think most of the kids I know, if you asked them their greatest fear, it would be nuclear war. I mean, everybody, all kids are scared to death they won't live to be 30. And while adolescents in the 50s and 60s didn't tend to link their fear of nuclear war to decisions to reproduce, a number of adolescents surveyed by sociologists in the 1980s stated that the nuclear threat had made them question whether they actually wanted to have children of their own. In a British study conducted in 1985, 80% of participants admitted their fears of nuclear war had affected their plans for their personal lives. And in a survey of high school students in Los Angeles, Boston, Baltimore, and Philadelphia in 1978, students were asked, "Have thermonuclear advances influenced your plans for marriage, having children, or planning for the future?" And 50% said that they had. One student stated, "I don't choose to bring up children in a world of such horrors and dangers of defamation." But adolescents also use the threat of nuclear war to assert the value of their current life stage and living in the here and now. 16-year-old Lisa says in an American study from 1983, "I'm probably more carefree, like do the things I want to do. I mean, I don't hold back. I feel it's my chance to grab it. Get it if you want it, because it might never come again." To conclude, children's and adolescents' narratives of nuclear fear offer historians a different angle on the ordinary experience of Cold War Britain and the United States that does not simply repeat the priorities and chronologies of adult citizens. However, listening to these voices also allow us to see how young people asserted the value and significance of adolescence in its own right, rather than simply as a prelude to a mature adult future, and how they used the language of age both to critique the adult generation and the broader geopolitical situation within which they were growing up. Thank you.